The automatic doors of Riverside High School swung open with their usual mechanical hum, but today they might as well have been the gates of a gladiatorial arena. Emma Rodriguez guided her sleek racing wheelchair through the entrance, her calloused hands gripping the push rims with practiced ease. What she didn't know was that Jake Morrison and his crew had been waiting for exactly this moment, positioned like predators who had finally spotted their perfect prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sunlight streaming through the glass doors created an almost cinematic backdrop for what was about to unfold. But there would be nothing Hollywood about the cruelty these teenagers were prepared to unleash. They had spent weeks watching her, studying her routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity to assert their dominance over someone they saw as fundamentally different, fundamentally lesser. What they couldn't have imagined was that the quiet girl in the wheelchair was about to teach them a lesson about assumptions that would echo through the halls of Riverside High for years to come. The fluorescent lights of Riverside High School cast their harsh glow across polished linoleum floors as Emma Rodriguez navigated the crowded hallway with the fluid grace that came from years of experience. Her midnight blue racing wheelchair moved with precision through the maze of students' backpacks and scattered textbooks, but what struck most people wasn't her mobility. It was the quiet confidence she carried, despite being one of only 3 students using mobility devices in the entire school. Emma had transferred to Riverside just 2 months ago when her family relocated from Phoenix to this small town in Oregon. And the adjustment had been more challenging than she'd anticipated. At 17, Emma possessed the kind of understated beauty that bloomed from inner strength rather than conventional features. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held a depth that suggested she'd seen more of life than most her age. Her upper body bore the subtle but unmistakable muscle definition of an athlete, though she kept this hidden beneath loose-fitting hoodies and casual shirts. Most students at Riverside assumed her wheelchair meant weakness, limitation, dependency. They had no idea they were looking at someone whose alarm clock went off at 4:30 every morning for training sessions that would break most people. The hallways of Riverside High reflected the demographics of the town itself, predominantly white, middle class, with the kind of insular thinking that came from limited exposure to diversity. The school had been built in the 1980s with accessibility as an afterthought, resulting in a maze of ramps, modified bathrooms, and elevators that broke down with concerning frequency. For most students, these accommodations were invisible infrastructure they never had to think about. For Emma, they represented a daily navigation challenge that required constant awareness and planning. Jake Morrison commanded the social hierarchy. At Riverside High, with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real opposition. At 18, he stood 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and confident swagger of the star quarterback he was destined to become at the local community. In college, his blonde hair was styled with expensive products, and his clothes bore the subtle logos that marked him as someone with money. More importantly, his father owned Morrison Construction, the largest employer in town, which meant that crossing Jake carried implications that extended far beyond high school social dynamics. Jake's inner circle consisted of 3 other boys who had known each other since elementary school. There was Danny Walsh, whose red hair and quick wit made him the group's designated entertainer, always ready with a cutting remark or cruel observation. Beside him stood Marcus Thompson, a hulking figure whose primary qualification for the group was his willingness to intimidate anyone Jake pointed toward. Finally, there was Alex Chen, the strategist of the group, whose quiet intelligence was unfortunately channeled toward finding new ways to torment their chosen targets. The four of them had established an unwritten but universally understood system at Riverside High. They determined who belonged and who didn't, who deserved respect and who deserved ridicule. Their victims were carefully selected based on perceived vulnerabilities. The overweight kids, the ones with obvious learning differences, anyone whose family situation was known to be difficult. They operated with the confidence of young men who had never faced meaningful consequences for their actions, protected by their family's influence and the general reluctance of adults to confront wealthy, influential parents. Emma had first appeared on their radar during her second week at Riverside High. She'd been eating lunch alone in the courtyard, reading what appeared to be a training manual while mechanically working through a carefully portioned meal. Jake had pointed her out to his friends with the casual cruelty that characterized his worldview. Here was someone who checked all their boxes, obviously different, apparently isolated and seemingly defenseless. The wheelchair in their minds was simply the most obvious symbol of her fundamental inadequacy for their world. What they didn't know, what nobody at Riverside High knew, was that Emma Rodriguez was currently ranked third in the world in her classification for Paralympic racing. Her bedroom walls were covered with medals from international competitions, and her training logs detailed workouts that would challenge Olympic athletes. She held 3 world records and had been secretly selected for the upcoming Paralympic team, though the official announcement wouldn't come for another month. The training manual she read during lunch contained strategies developed by the world's best coaches, and her carefully portioned meals were designed by sports nutritionists to optimize her performance. The reason for Emma's secrecy wasn't shame or modesty, it was strategy. Her previous school in Phoenix had treated her like a celebrity once word got out about her athletic achievements, and she'd found the constant attention exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. Students who had never spoken to her suddenly wanted to be her friend. Teachers gave her special treatment she didn't want, and the administration used her success for publicity purposes that made her uncomfortable. When her family decided to relocate for her father's job, Emma had begged them to let her have a normal senior year, to experience high school as just another student, rather than as the disabled girl who had overcome the odds. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, had reluctantly agreed to keep her athletic career private, understanding their daughter's desire for normalcy, even if they worried about her facing discrimination without the protection her achievements might provide. Maria worked as a bilingual social worker in the local hospital system, while Carlos had taken a position as an aerospace engineer with a small firm that contracted with NASA. They were educated, professional people who had raised Emma to be independent and self-reliant, but they also understood the particular challenges faced by disabled people in environments that weren't designed for them. The Rodriguez family had moved to Oregon specifically because Emma's longtime coach, Patricia Kowalski, had relocated there to establish a new training facility. Patricia was a former Paralympian herself, who had become one of the most respected coaches in the sport, and her willingness to continue working with Emma had been the deciding factor in the family's move. The training facility was located 45 minutes from their new home, which meant Emma made the drive every morning and evening, fitting her rigorous training schedule around her high school requirements. Emma's typical day began at 4:15 in the morning, when her alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness. By 4:30, she was in her car, a specially modified Honda Civic that allowed her to drive using hand controls. The early morning roads were empty as she made her way to the training facility, her racing wheelchair secured in the specially designed carrier mounted on her car's roof. The facility itself was a marvel of engineering and design, with an indoor track that precisely replicated the dimensions and surface conditions of major Paralympic venues around the world. Her morning training sessions lasted 2.5 hours and typically focused on speed work, technique refinement, and race-specific preparation. Patricia demanded perfection in every aspect of Emma's performance, from the angle of her body, position to the precise timing of her gear shifts. These weren't casual workouts, they were preparation for competition at the highest levels of international sport, where hundredths of seconds determined the difference between gold medals and fourth-place finishes. After training, Emma would shower and change at the facility before making the drive back to Riverside High, usually arriving just in time for first period. Her classmates saw a quiet girl who sometimes seemed tired in morning classes, never imagining that she'd already completed a workout that would challenge professional athletes. During lunch, while other students socialized or played games, Emma used the time to study training videos on her tablet, analyzing the technique of her international competitors and reviewing her own performance footage with the critical eye of someone who understood that continuous improvement was the price of excellence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her afternoon schedule was structured around getting back to the training facility for evening sessions that focused on endurance work and strength training. These workouts were often even more demanding than the morning sessions, designed to push her body to its limits and build the kind of cardiovascular fitness required for races that could last anywhere from 45 seconds to over an hour, depending on the distance. By the time she returned home each evening, usually around 8 o'clock, Emma was exhausted in the specific way that came from having pushed her body to perform at levels most people couldn't imagine. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that her classmates saw her wheelchair as a symbol of limitation when it was actually her gateway to a level of athletic achievement that none of them would ever approach. Her racing chair was a marvel of engineering, constructed from carbon fiber and titanium with custom wheels and a gearing system that allowed her to reach speeds that would be dangerous for most people to attempt. The chair had cost more than many students' cars, and its maintenance required the kind of technical knowledge typically associated with Formula One racing teams. But none of this was visible to her classmates at Riverside High, who saw only what they expected to see, a disabled girl who seemed to keep to herself and who represented an easy target for those inclined toward cruelty. Jake Morrison and his friends had been watching Emma for weeks now, noting her routines, her apparent isolation, and what they interpreted as her vulnerability. They had no understanding of the discipline required for her lifestyle, the sacrifices she made daily, or the mental toughness that had been forged through years of competition at the highest levels. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Emma had completed her training session, analyzing split times with Patricia and working on starts, which were crucial in the shorter distance events that were Emma's specialty. Her times were improving steadily, and Patricia had mentioned that several international coaches had been asking about Emma's availability for training camps and competitions. The conversation had left Emma feeling energized and focused, the kind of positive momentum that came from knowing her hard work was producing measurable results. As she drove toward Riverside High, Emma found herself thinking about the upcoming official announcement of the Paralympic team. In just a few weeks, her secret would be out, but by then she would have experienced a full semester of normal high school life. She was particularly looking forward to graduation, imagining the surprise on her classmates' faces when they learned what she'd been accomplishing, while they thought she was just the quiet girl in the wheelchair. The parking lot at Riverside I was already filling up as Emma arrived, students emerging from cars and buses with the casual energy of teenagers for whom the biggest concern was usually the next test or social drama. Emma parked in one of the designated accessible spaces near the main entrance, a small privilege that she knew some students resented without understanding the necessity. She had heard muttered comments about how convenient it must be to always get the good parking spots, comments that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how accessibility accommodations actually worked. As she transferred from her car to her everyday wheelchair, a lightweight model designed for daily use rather than racing, Emma noticed Jake Morrison and his crew gathered near the main entrance. This wasn't unusual. They often positioned themselves where they could observe and comment on arriving students, establishing their presence and maintaining their social dominance through visibility and intimidation. What was different this morning was the way they seemed to be watching her specifically, their attention focused and predatory in a way that made Emma's instincts, sharpened by years of athletic competition, go on alert. Jake Morrison leaned against the brick wall near the entrance with the casual arrogance that had become his trademark. His Letterman jacket, earned through 2 seasons of varsity football, hung loosely over his broad shoulders, and his expensive sneakers were pristine, despite the wet Oregon morning. To casual observers, he looked like the epitome of American high school success, attractive, athletic, confident, and popular. What wasn't visible was the particular kind of emptiness that drove his need to diminish others, the insecurity that required constant validation through the systematic humiliation of anyone he perceived as different or weak. Danny Walsh stood beside him, practically vibrating with anticipation. Danny had always been the most openly cruel member of the group, the one who seemed to genuinely enjoy the process of breaking down other people's confidence. His red hair and freckled complexion gave him an almost innocent appearance that made his cruelty even more jarring when it emerged. He had spent the previous evening researching inspiration porn videos online, collecting what he thought were hilarious examples of disabled athletes being celebrated for basic achievements, ammunition. He was eager to deploy against Emma. Marcus Thompson loomed behind them, his bulk serving as both physical intimidation and silent threat. Marcus rarely spoke during these encounters, but his presence communicated volumes about what might happen if anyone tried to interfere with Jake's entertainment. His role was to ensure that bystanders remained exactly that. Bystanders who might feel uncomfortable but wouldn't risk becoming targets themselves by intervening. Alex Chen completed the group, his keen intelligence unfortunately channeled toward developing increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological torture. Alex understood social dynamics in ways that allowed him to identify precisely which words or actions would cause the maximum emotional damage to their chosen victims. He had been observing Emma for weeks, noting her routines, her apparent isolation, and what he interpreted as vulnerability that could be exploited for their amusement. As Emma approached the entrance, transferring her backpack to her lap and checking to ensure she had everything she needed for the school day, the 4 boys exchanged glances that communicated their shared intent. This had become routine for them. The selection of a target, the coordination of their approach, and the systematic deployment of humiliation designed to reinforce their position in the school's social hierarchy while diminishing someone they perceived as inferior. The automatic doors sensed Emma's approach and swung open with their familiar mechanical sound. But instead of the clear path she expected, she found her way blocked by Jake Morrison's deliberately positioned legs. He had extended his feet across the entrance in a gesture that appeared casual, but was clearly intentional, forcing Emma to stop her forward momentum and confront the obstacle he had created. "Whoops," Jake said with exaggerated surprise, making no move to clear the path. "Didn't see you there." The words were delivered with a smirk that made it clear he had seen her perfectly well and that this obstruction was entirely deliberate. His tone carried the particular kind of false friendliness that characterized the beginning of what Emma was beginning to recognize as a planned encounter. Emma felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. She had faced this kind of situation before, in other schools and other contexts, and she knew that how she responded in the next few moments would likely determine how these boys treated her. For the remainder of her time at Riverside High, her athletic training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to think strategically rather than react emotionally. But it had also shown her that sometimes the best strategy was to avoid confrontation entirely. "Excuse me," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heartbeat. She had learned through experience that engaging minimally often provided the quickest path through these situations, that avoiding any behavior that could be interpreted as defiant or challenging sometimes allowed bullies to lose interest more quickly. But Jake Morrison was not interested in a quick resolution. He had been planning this encounter, and he intended to extract maximum entertainment value from it. Instead of moving his legs, he leaned forward with exaggerated concern, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh wow, you're in a wheelchair," he announced loudly, as if this was a shocking discovery rather than something that had been obvious to everyone in the school for 2 months. "That must be so hard for you. I mean, there's probably so many things you can't do." His voice carried across the entrance area, drawing the attention of other students who were arriving for the school day. Danny Walsh stepped forward, barely containing his excitement at being part of what he clearly saw as entertainment. "Yeah, like sports," he added with theatrical sadness. "I bet you've never been able to experience the joy of athletics. That's probably the worst part, right? Missing out on all the physical activities that make high school so special." The irony of this statement was so profound that Emma almost laughed despite her growing anger. Here were boys who probably couldn't run a 6-minute mile, who thought football practice was demanding, telling someone who regularly trained at levels that would destroy them that she was missing out on athletics. But Emma kept her expression neutral, understanding that any reaction would only encourage them to continue. Marcus Thompson moved to block her potential retreat, his bulk positioned to ensure that Emma couldn't simply back away from the situation. The coordination of their movements revealed that this wasn't spontaneous harassment, but rather a planned encounter, something they had discussed and strategized about in advance. Alex Chen, meanwhile, positioned himself where he could observe Emma's facial expressions and body language, looking for signs of the emotional distress that would indicate their tactics were working. Alex took particular pleasure in the psychological aspects of their bullying, in identifying the specific words or approaches that would cause the most damage to their target's confidence and self-esteem. Emma found herself trapped in a situation that was rapidly escalating beyond simple rudeness into something more systematic and threatening. The entrance area was filling with students who had to navigate around the confrontation, some glancing curiously at the scene, but most hurrying past with the practiced indifference that characterized bystander behavior in situations like this. "I just want to get to class," Emma said, trying to keep her voice level despite her growing frustration. She could feel the familiar heat of anger building in her chest, the same emotion that fueled her most competitive performances, but which she knew she needed to control carefully in this context. Jake Morrison's smile widened, clearly pleased that he had succeeded in creating discomfort. "Oh, but we're just trying to be friendly," he said with mock innocence. "You know, welcome you to our school. Make sure you feel included. I mean, it must be lonely being so different from everyone else." The word different was loaded with implication, delivered in a way that made it clear Jake viewed difference as inherently negative, as something that justified exclusion and mistreatment. Emma had heard this kind of language before, the way People used different as a polite substitute for inferior, and she felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Different how? Emma asked, her voice carrying a slight edge that suggested her patience was wearing thin. It was a question that forced Jake to be more explicit about his meaning, to move beyond coded language into territory that might reveal the true nature of his attitude. Danny Walsh couldn't contain his excitement at this opening. "Well, you know," he said with exaggerated gestures toward her wheelchair, "the whole can't walk thing. That's got to make everything harder, right? Like there's probably tons of stuff you just can't do that the rest of us take for granted." The presumption in his words was staggering. These boys, who knew nothing about Emma's life, capabilities, or achievements, had decided that her wheelchair defined the limits of her existence. They spoke about her as if she couldn't hear them, as if her presence in the conversation was incidental to their discussion of her limitations. Emma felt something shift inside her, a familiar sensation she recognized from the moments before her best athletic performances. It was the feeling of someone pushing her beyond her tolerance, of casual dismissal transforming into something that demanded a response. Her years of training had taught her that there were moments when backing down was not an option, when the only path forward was through confrontation. "Actually," Emma said, her voice gaining strength and clarity, "there isn't much I can't do. Probably less than you think." The words carried an undertone that suggested there was more to this statement than appeared on the surface, but the boys were too focused on their own entertainment to catch the implication. Jake Morrison laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Right," he said with obvious disbelief. "I'm sure you're just as capable as everyone else. That's why you need special parking spots and ramps and all that accommodation stuff, because you're just as able as the rest of us." The reduction of accessibility accommodations to special treatment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how equality actually worked, but it also showed the depth of Jake's sense of entitlement. In his worldview, any accommodation that allowed disabled people to participate equally was an unfair advantage, rather than a leveling of an uneven playing field. Emma felt her competitive instincts fully engaging now. The same mental state that had carried her to victory in dozens of races against the world's best athletes. These boys thought they understood limitation, thought they could define her capabilities based on their own assumptions and prejudices. They had no idea they were confronting someone who had dedicated her life to proving exactly those kinds of assumptions wrong. "You know what?" Emma said, her voice carrying a confidence that seemed to surprise the boys. "Maybe we should test that theory sometime." The words hung in the air like a challenge, transforming the dynamic of the encounter in ways that Jake Morrison wasn't quite prepared for. The suggestion that Emma might actually be capable of competing with them in any meaningful way was so far outside Jake's worldview that he struggled to process it as anything other than delusion or desperate bravado. His response was immediate and cruel, designed to crush whatever confidence Emma might be building. "Test it?" Jake laughed harshly. "What are you going to do, race us? Challenge us to a basketball game? Face it, you're in that chair because your body doesn't work right, and no amount of positive thinking is going to change that basic reality." The words were intended to be devastating, to reduce Emma to tears or anger that would provide the entertainment value Jake was seeking. But instead of crumbling, Emma smiled, an expression that carried layers of meaning that the boys couldn't quite decipher. "Racing actually sounds perfect," Emma said, her voice steady and confident. "I'd love to race you sometime, Jake. All of you, actually, anytime you're ready." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to what they had anticipated, that the four boys found themselves momentarily off balance. They had expected tears, anger, or retreat, but Emma's calm confidence was something they hadn't prepared for. Danny Walsh was the first to recover, seizing on what he assumed was an opportunity for even greater humiliation. "Oh, this is perfect," he said with gleeful malice. "The crippled girl wants to race the football players. This is going to be hilarious." The use of the slur was intended to wound, to reduce Emma to a category that justified their contempt. But Emma's expression didn't change. If anything, her smile became more pronounced, as if Danny had just confirmed something she had suspected about their character. "I prefer athlete, actually," Emma said calmly. "But sure, let's make this interesting. When do you want to do this?" The boys exchanged glances, uncertain how to proceed. This wasn't following their usual script, where targets became increasingly distressed until they either fled or provided the emotional breakdown that served as entertainment. Emma's willingness to engage, her apparent confidence, was disrupting their established patterns. Alex Chen, always the strategist, sensed an opportunity to regain control of the situation. "You're serious?" he asked with apparent amazement. "You actually think you can beat us in a race, like an actual foot race?" The specification of foot race was intended to emphasize Emma's disability, to make explicit the apparent absurdity of her challenge. But Emma's response revealed a depth of confidence that none of them had expected. "I didn't specify what kind of race," Emma said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "But sure, let's say a standard distance. Quarter mile, maybe? That seems fair." The distance was significant in ways the boys couldn't understand. A quarter mile was Emma's specialty distance, the length at which she held one of her world records. It was long enough to require strategy and endurance, but short enough that pure speed could be decisive. Emma had raced that distance hundreds of times against competitors who had dedicated their lives to the sport, and she had won more often than she had lost. Jake Morrison felt the situation slipping away from his control, the dynamic shifting, in ways that made him uncomfortable. His strategy had always relied on maintaining clear superiority over his targets. But Emma's confidence was creating uncertainty about the outcome that he didn't like. "Fine," Jake said, his voice carrying more aggression than before. "But when you lose, and you will lose, you have to admit that you don't belong here, that you're not as good as the rest of us, and that everyone who makes accommodations for you is just feeling sorry for you." The stakes Jake was proposing revealed the true nature of his worldview, that Emma's presence at Riverside High was conditional on her acceptance of inferiority, that her right to equal treatment depended on her willingness to acknowledge her lesser status. It was a worldview that reduced human worth to physical capability and social conformity. Emma considered the proposed terms, understanding that accepting them would put more than just a race on the line. Jake was essentially demanding that she stake her dignity and her right to equal treatment on the outcome of a single athletic competition. It was the kind of bet that most people would refuse as fundamentally unfair. But Emma Rodriguez was not most people. She was someone who had spent years competing at levels where the difference between victory and defeat was measured in hundredths of seconds, where mental toughness was as important as physical capability. More importantly, she was someone who understood that some challenges once offered had to be accepted regardless of the risks involved. "Deal," Emma said simply, extending her hand toward Jake Morrison. "But if I win, you apologize to every student you've ever bullied at this school publicly, and you never harass anyone again as long as you're here." The counterproposal was as shocking to Jake as his original terms had been to Emma. The idea that he might lose, that he might be required to acknowledge wrongdoing and change his behavior, was so far outside his expectations that he struggled to process the suggestion. But backing down now, in front of his friends and the growing crowd of students who had stopped to watch the confrontation, would mean admitting uncertainty about his ability to defeat a girl in a wheelchair. His entire social position depended on an image of unquestioned superiority, and any sign of doubt would undermine the foundation of his power. "Fine," Jake said, grasping Emma's hand with more force than necessary. "This Friday after school, quarter-mile around the track, you're going to regret this." As Emma shook hands with Jake Morrison, sealing an agreement that would change everything for both of them, neither could have imagined how the next few days would unfold. Jake was confident he was about to deliver the most humiliating defeat of his bullying career, while Emma was quietly calculating split times and gear ratios for a race she had essentially already won. The crowd of students who had witnessed the exchange began to disperse, their whispered conversations carrying news of the upcoming race throughout the school with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve. By the end of first period, everyone at Riverside High would know that the quiet girl in the wheelchair had challenged the star athlete to a race, and most would assume they knew how it would end. But Emma Rodriguez carried herself through the rest of that morning with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that assumptions, particularly assumptions about disabled people, were often the most dangerous kind of ignorance. She had spent years proving people wrong about what was possible, and Friday afternoon would simply be another opportunity to demonstrate that limitation was often more about imagination than capability. As she navigated the hallways between classes, Emma found herself looking forward to the race with the same anticipation she felt before major competitions. There would be no world records at stake this time, no Paralympic qualifying times to achieve, but there would be something equally important: the chance to challenge the assumptions that allowed bullying to flourish and to show her classmates that strength came in forms they had never imagined. News of the challenge spread through Riverside High School like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in hallways and urgent text messages between classes. By lunchtime, the story had evolved and mutated through multiple retellings, each version adding new details or changing the stakes. Some students claimed Jake had demanded Emma crawl on her hands if she lost, while others insisted she had challenged him to a wrestling match. The truth was dramatic enough, but high school gossip required embellishment to maintain interest. Emma found herself the center of attention in ways she had carefully avoided since arriving at Riverside High. Students who had never acknowledged her existence suddenly wanted to know her story, her motivations, her training regimen. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had taken a confrontation with the school's biggest bully to make her classmates curious about who she actually was as a person. During her lunch period, Emma sat in her usual spot in the courtyard, but instead of the solitude she typically enjoyed, she was surrounded by students asking questions with a mixture of genuine curiosity and morbid fascination. Sarah Martinez, a junior who had been in Emma's chemistry class since the beginning of the semester, approached with obvious concern. "Emma, are you crazy?" Sarah asked, sitting down across from her with the familiarity of someone who felt entitled to an opinion about Emma's life choices. "Jake Morrison is basically a professional athlete. He's been offered scholarships to 3 different colleges. For football, there's no way you can beat him in a race." The assumption that Jake's high school athletic success translated to superiority in all physical competitions revealed how little Sarah understood about athletic specialization. But Emma appreciated the underlying concern. "I appreciate you worrying about me," Emma replied carefully, "but I think I know what I'm doing." Michael Torres, a senior who served as sports editor for the school newspaper, had been hovering nearby with obvious journalistic interest. "Can I ask what made you think you could take on Jake?" he inquired, his phone already out to record her response. "I mean, no offense, but this seems like a pretty big risk for someone in your situation." The phrase, "your situation," hung in, the air like a euphemism that revealed more about Michael's assumptions than Emma's actual circumstances. She had heard variations of this language throughout her life, people who couldn't quite bring themselves to say disabled, but who clearly viewed her wheelchair as defining her limitations rather than simply being a tool she used for mobility. "What exactly do you think my situation is?" Emma asked, her voice carrying enough edge to make Michael realize he might be stepping into problematic territory. The question forced him to articulate assumptions he had been comfortable leaving implicit, and his discomfort was obvious. "Well, you know," Michael stammered, "the whole wheelchair thing. I mean, racing requires legs, right? That's just basic physics." His response revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that most people had about Paralympic sports, the assumption that disability automatically meant inability rather than simply requiring different techniques and equipment. Emma's smile carried layers of meaning that Michael couldn't quite decipher. "Physics is actually really interesting when it comes to racing," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the subject. "There are a lot of variables most people don't consider." Before Michael could follow up with additional questions, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison and his crew, who approached Emma's table with the swagger of conquerors surveying their domain. The students who had been gathering around Emma quickly scattered, unwilling to risk becoming collateral damage in whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Jake pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, his body language radiating the confidence of someone who believed the outcome of Friday's race was predetermined. "Having second thoughts yet?" he asked with a smirk that suggested he hoped the answer was yes. "It's not too late to back out gracefully. I mean, I'd understand if you realized you bit off more than you could chew." And the offer of an easy exit was delivered with false magnanimity, designed to make Emma feel like Jake was being generous while simultaneously reinforcing his assumption of inevitable victory. It was the kind of psychological manipulation that had served him well in previous bullying situations, where targets often preferred escape to confrontation, even when escape meant accepting humiliation. "I'm good," Emma replied calmly, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty Jake was hoping to detect. "Actually, I was thinking we should make this more interesting. Maybe get some spectators involved, make it a real event." The suggestion that Emma wanted to expand the audience for her anticipated defeat was so unexpected that Jake found himself momentarily off balance. In his experience, people facing inevitable humiliation preferred privacy, not publicity. Emma's confidence was beginning to create doubt where none had existed before. Danny Walsh, eager to regain control of the narrative, jumped into the conversation with characteristic cruelty. "Oh, this is perfect," he said with obvious glee. "We should definitely get the whole school involved. Maybe sell tickets to the freak show. I bet people would pay good money to watch the cripple get put in her place." The casual use of slurs was intended to provoke an emotional reaction that would demonstrate Emma's vulnerability. But instead of rising to the bait, Emma simply looked at Danny with the kind of calm assessment that made him suddenly uncomfortable. "I prefer the term athlete," she said quietly, "but I like your idea about selling tickets. We could donate the proceeds to the school's accessibility fund." The counter-proposal was so smoothly delivered that it took Danny a moment to realize he had been outmaneuvered. Emma had taken his cruel suggestion and transformed it into something positive, using his own words to highlight the school's need for better accommodations while positioning herself as someone concerned with helping other disabled students. Marcus Thompson, who rarely spoke during these encounters, found himself curious despite his usual role as silent intimidation. "You really think you can beat Jake?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine puzzlement rather than malice. "I mean, he runs a 5-minute mile. That's pretty fast." D. The specific time Marcus mentioned was intended to be impressive, and it was a respectable pace for a high school athlete. But Emma's smile suggested she had thoughts about 5-minute miles that the boys wouldn't expect. That is a good time, she acknowledged, her tone suggesting appreciation for athletic achievement while carefully avoiding any indication of how it compared to her own capabilities. Alex Chen, always the most perceptive member of the group, sensed undercurrents in Emma's responses that didn't match the narrative they had constructed about her. "You seem awfully confident for someone who's about to get destroyed," he observed, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "What aren't you telling us?" The question revealed that Alex, unlike his friends, was beginning to suspect that Emma's willingness to accept their challenge might be based on information they didn't possess. It was the kind of strategic thinking that made Alex potentially dangerous, but also the quality that might eventually lead him to question the assumptions underlying their treatment of Emma. Emma met Alex's gaze directly, her expression giving nothing away. "I guess you'll find out on Friday," she said simply, gathering her materials and preparing to leave. This should be educational for everyone involved. As Emma transferred her backpack to her lap and prepared to navigate away from the table, Jake felt compelled to make one final attempt at psychological dominance. "Just remember," he called, "after her, when this is over, everyone's going to know exactly what you are. No more pretending you're something special." The words were intended to be prophetic, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow between now and Friday. But Emma's response suggested she was looking forward to exactly the kind of revelation Jake was threatening. "You're absolutely right," she said, turning back with a smile that carried more confidence than Jake was comfortable seeing. "Everyone is going to know exactly what I am." The exchange left Jake and his friends with the uncomfortable feeling that they were missing something important. But their investment in the narrative of Emma's inevitable defeat made it difficult to seriously consider alternatives. They had built their social dominance on the assumption that they could accurately assess people's capabilities, and acknowledging uncertainty about Emma would require questioning the foundation of their worldview. As Emma made her way to her afternoon classes, she found herself thinking about the conversation with her coach that morning. Patricia Kowalski had been thrilled to hear about the challenge, seeing it as an opportunity for Emma to begin transitioning from her anonymous persona to public acknowledgement of her achievements. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding," Patricia had suggested. "Your classmates are going to find out eventually anyway, and this could be the perfect way to control the narrative." Emma's afternoon training session took on special significance as she began preparing specifically for Friday's race. The quarter-mile distance was one of her strongest events, and her personal best time would not only beat Jake Morrison, but would establish a new high school record in Oregon. More importantly, her racing wheelchair and technique were optimized for exactly this kind of competition. Patricia had spent the afternoon session working on race strategy, discussing everything from starting position to gear selection to pacing. "The key thing to remember," Patricia had explained, "is that this isn't really about beating one high school bully. This is about challenging assumptions that affect every disabled athlete, every disabled student, every disabled person who has ever been underestimated because of other people's ignorance." The weight of representation was something Emma had always carried, but Friday's race would make it explicit in ways that felt both exciting and terrifying. She would no longer be able to hide behind anonymity, to experience high school as just another student. Her athletic achievements would become public knowledge, and with that knowledge would come expectations, attention, and responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as Emma completed her evening training session, pushing herself through intervals that would have challenged Olympic athletes, she felt the familiar surge of competitive excitement that preceded her best performances. Jake Morrison thought he understood racing, thought his high school success qualified him to judge her capabilities. Friday afternoon would be an education for everyone involved. The next morning brought an escalation in attention that Emma found both amusing and concerning. Students who had never spoken to her were suddenly eager to offer advice, support, or warnings about what she was getting herself into. The hallways buzzed with conversations about the upcoming race, with unofficial betting pools and elaborate speculation about what would happen when Emma inevitably lost. Taylor Phillips, captain of the girls' track team, approached Emma at her locker with obvious concern and a hint of professional curiosity. "I heard about your challenge," Taylor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood athletic competition. "I have to ask, do you have any actual racing experience? Because Jake is legitimately fast, and this could get really ugly if you're not prepared." The question revealed Taylor's assumption that Emma's challenge was based on courage rather than capability, the kind of inspiring but doomed gesture that made for good movies but poor real-life outcomes. Emma appreciated Taylor's concern while recognizing the limitations of her perspective. "I have some experience," Emma replied carefully, unwilling to reveal the full extent of her background, but also not wanting to lie to someone who was trying to help. "I think I'll be okay." Taylor's expression suggested she interpreted some experience as recreational activity rather than elite competition. "Look, I've been running competitively for 6 years," she said with the authority of someone accustomed to being the expert in athletic conversations. "Quarter mile is a brutal distance. It's long enough that you can't just sprint the whole way, but short enough that you can't really pace yourself either. Jake's been training for this kind of thing since middle school." The explanation of quarter-mile strategy was accurate but incomplete, failing to account for the different physiological demands and technical requirements of wheelchair racing. Emma listened politely while mentally reviewing her own training logs, which included dozens of quarter-mile races against competitors who would make Jake Morrison look like he was standing still. "I appreciate the advice," Emma said sincerely, recognizing that Taylor's concern came from a good place, even if her assumptions were problematic. "Are you planning to watch on Friday?" Taylor nodded enthusiastically. "The whole track team will be there. Honestly, most of the school is talking about it. I just hope Jake doesn't do anything too cruel when he wins. He's not exactly known for good sportsmanship." The assumption that Jake's victory was inevitable was so universal among Emma's classmates that she was beginning to understand how shocking Friday's revelation would be. These students had constructed their understanding of ability and disability around assumptions that would be completely overturned by her performance. During her lunch period, Emma found herself approached by Jennifer Walsh, Danny's younger sister, who had been watching the developing situation with obvious distress. Jennifer was a sophomore who had always felt uncomfortable with her brother's bullying behavior, but had never found the courage to challenge him directly. "I wanted to apologize for my brother," Jennifer said quietly, glancing around to make sure Danny wasn't nearby. "He's been horrible about this whole thing, making jokes and saying terrible stuff about you. I think what you're doing is really brave, even if it doesn't work out." The phrase, "even if it doesn't work out," revealed that Jennifer, like everyone else, expected Emma to lose badly. But her willingness to distance herself from her brother's cruelty suggested a moral framework that Emma found encouraging. "Thank you for saying that," Emma replied warmly. "It means a lot to know that not everyone thinks this is just entertainment." The conversation reminded Emma that bullying affected more than just direct targets. Family members, friends, and bystanders also carried the weight of behavior they couldn't control but felt responsible for witnessing. As the week progressed, Emma found herself analyzing the social dynamics at Riverside High with new clarity. The upcoming race had revealed fault lines she hadn't previously noticed, dividing students between those who supported her courage and those who anticipated her humiliation. More interesting were the students caught in the middle, those who admired her willingness to stand up to Jake, but who couldn't imagine her actually succeeding. Coach Williams, who oversaw the school's track and field program, had approached Emma on Wednesday with obvious concern about the liability implications of an unsanctioned race involving school facilities. "I understand there's some kind of challenge happening on Friday," he said carefully, "and while I can't officially endorse it, I want to make sure everyone involved understands safety protocols." The conversation revealed that word had reached the administration, creating potential complications Emma hadn't anticipated. "Is there going to be a problem with using the track?" she asked, suddenly worried that bureaucratic concerns might derail the entire confrontation. Coach Williams considered his response carefully. "Technically, the track is available for student use after school hours," he said slowly. "And as long as no one gets hurt, I don't see any reason to intervene, but I'll be there to make sure things don't get out of hand." The promise of adult supervision was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it meant the race would happen as planned, concerning because it suggested the administration expected problems that might require intervention. Emma found herself wondering what kind of behavior they anticipated from Jake and his friends. Thursday brought an unexpected development when Patricia Kowalski arrived at Riverside High during Emma's lunch period, ostensibly to discuss training schedules, but actually to observe the environment where her athlete had been facing harassment. Patricia's presence created immediate buzz among students who recognized her as someone important, but couldn't quite place her significance. "So this is where you've been hiding," Patricia said with amusement as she surveyed the typical high school cafeteria scene. "I have to say, after watching you compete against world-class athletes, seeing you navigate teenage social dynamics is almost more impressive." The comment reminded Emma of the surreal nature of her situation, someone who regularly competed at the highest levels of international sport, being bullied by teenagers who thought high school athletics represented the pinnacle of physical achievement. The disconnect was almost too absurd to believe. "I brought something for tomorrow," Patricia continued, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had been planning a surprise. "Your new racing chair arrived from the manufacturer this morning. I thought Friday might be the perfect time to test it out." The mention of new equipment created immediate interest among nearby students, though none of them understood the significance of what Patricia was describing. Emma's current racing chair was already far superior to anything most people had ever seen, but the new model incorporated technological advances that would make it even faster and more responsive. "The manufacturer is calling it the Phoenix series," Patricia explained, her voice carrying professional excitement. "It's designed specifically for athletes in your classification, with gear ratios optimized for explosive acceleration over shorter distances. Your quarter-mile times should improve by at least 2 seconds. 2 seconds represented an enormous improvement in a race that typically lasted less than a minute. The difference between good performance and world record territory. Emma felt her competitive excitement building as she imagined racing in equipment designed to optimize her specific strengths and techniques. As Patricia prepared to leave, she offered one final piece of advice that carried weight beyond the immediate situation. "Remember," she said quietly, "tomorrow isn't just about winning a race. It's about challenging assumptions that limit what people think is possible. Every disabled athlete who comes after you will benefit from what you're about to do." The reminder of broader implications helped Emma maintain perspective on what Friday's race really represented. This wasn't just about putting Jake Morrison in his place or defending her own dignity. It was about demonstrating that excellence came in forms most people never imagined, and that underestimating disabled athletes was not just wrong, but dangerous. Thursday evening's training session took on the intensity of pre-competition preparation, with Patricia fine-tuning every aspect of Emma's technique and strategy. They practiced starts until Emma's timing was perfect, worked on gear transitions until they were automatic, and reviewed race tactics until Emma could execute them under any conditions. The key thing to remember, Patricia emphasized as they concluded the session, is that Jake Morrison has probably never seen competitive wheelchair racing. He has no idea what you're actually capable of, and by the time he realizes what's happening, the race will be over. Emma nodded, feeling the familiar calm that settled over her before important competitions. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, not necessarily racing against high school bullies, but confronting situations where her capabilities would be judged against assumptions and prejudices. Tomorrow would simply be another opportunity to prove that limitation was often more about imagination than reality. As she drove home from the training facility, Emma found herself thinking about the text message she had received from her parents. Earlier that day, they would be attending Friday's race along with several family friends who had heard about the situation and wanted to show support. The idea of racing in front of people who understood her achievements created additional pressure, but also excitement about finally being able to compete openly rather than in secret. The final day before the race dawned with an electricity that seemed to permeate the entire school building. Students who normally paid no attention to athletic events were talking about attending Emma's challenge, creating an audience that would be far larger than anyone had originally anticipated. The story had even spread to neighboring schools, with social media posts generating interest throughout the region. Emma arrived at school to find her locker decorated with notes of support from students she barely knew. Expressions of encouragement that revealed how many people were secretly hoping she would succeed despite their doubts about her chances. The messages ranged from simple "good luck" to longer notes sharing personal stories about overcoming challenges and standing up to bullies. One note in particular caught her attention, written in careful handwriting on expensive stationery. "Dear Emma," it read, "I don't know you very well, but I wanted you to know that watching you stand up to Jake Morrison has inspired me to finally report what he did to my younger brother last year. Whatever happens today, you've already won something important. Thank you for being brave. Sincerely, Amanda Richardson." The note reminded Emma that her confrontation with Jake had implications beyond her own situation, that other students had been watching and drawing courage from her willingness to challenge the system that had protected him. The realization added weight to the afternoon's race, but also reinforced her determination to perform at her absolute best. During morning classes, Emma found it difficult to concentrate on academic work, her mind repeatedly returning to race, strategy and preparation details. Her teachers seemed to understand the distraction, with several offering words of encouragement that suggested the entire faculty was aware of what would happen after school. Mrs. Rodriguez, her calculus teacher, approached her after class with obvious concern and curiosity. "I understand you have a big race this afternoon," she said carefully. "I hope you know what you're doing. Jake Morrison is quite an athlete." Her comment revealed the same assumptions Emma had been hearing all week, that Jake's high school athletic success qualified him as a serious competitor, that her challenge was based on courage rather than capability. "I think it should be interesting," Emma replied diplomatically, unwilling to reveal confidence that might seem like arrogance, but also not wanting to pretend uncertainty she didn't feel. Lunchtime brought an unexpected visitor when Jake Morrison approached her table with his usual crew, but with a demeanor that seemed slightly different from their previous encounters. There was still arrogance in his bearing, but also something that might have been actual nervousness. "Last chance to back out with dignity," Jake offered, his voice carrying false generosity. I respect that you were willing to stand up for yourself, but this doesn't have to end with you getting embarrassed in front of the whole school." The offer revealed that Jake's confidence might not be as absolute as he pretended, that some part of him was beginning to question whether Emma's willingness to accept his challenge might be based on knowledge he didn't possess. But his investment in the narrative of inevitable victory made it impossible for him to seriously consider alternatives. "I appreciate the concern," Emma replied calmly, "but I'm looking forward to this afternoon. Should be educational for everyone involved." Her response carried the same confident undertone that had been puzzling Jake all week, a certainty that seemed incompatible with the reality he understood. As he walked away with his friends, Emma could see them engaged in animated discussion, their body language suggesting they were beginning to have doubts they couldn't quite articulate. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as Emma struggled to focus on classes while her mind raced through preparation details. Her racing wheelchair was waiting in Patricia's car, along with her competition gear and all the equipment that would transform her from the quiet student her classmates knew into the world-class athlete she actually was. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Emma felt the familiar surge of competitive excitement that preceded her best performances. The next hour would change everything, not just for her relationship with Jake Morrison and his crew, but for her entire experience at Riverside High School. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending to be someone she wasn't, no more allowing other people's assumptions to define her capabilities. The time for revelation had arrived, and Emma Rodriguez was ready to show her classmates exactly what they had been underestimating. The track was surrounded by nearly 300 students when Emma arrived in Patricia's specialized transport van. Jake Morrison stood at the starting line, stretching with the confidence of someone who had never lost a race. His crew filmed everything, expecting to capture Emma's humiliation for social media entertainment. Emma emerged from the van in her sleek carbon fiber racing wheelchair, moving with fluid precision that immediately caught everyone's attention. The machine looked like something from a Formula One garage, aerodynamic and purpose-built for speed. Gasps rippled through the crowd as students realized this wasn't the everyday wheelchair they knew. "What is that thing?" Danny Walsh whispered, his earlier confidence evaporating. Patricia handed Emma her racing gloves and helmet. "Remember, this is about more than winning," she said quietly. "You're representing every athlete who's been underestimated." Jake's face paled as he watched Emma's warm-up routine, her movements displaying years of professional training. The girl positioning herself at the starting line bore no resemblance to the quiet student he thought he knew. "Ready?" Coach Williams called out, serving as official starter. Emma's racing position was perfect, her body aerodynamically positioned, hands gripping specialized wheels. Jake crouched in his starting stance, suddenly aware that something was terribly wrong. The starting signal echoed across the field. Emma exploded forward with explosive power that stunned the crowd into silence. Her technique was flawless, gear shifts perfectly timed, acceleration that defied every assumption about wheelchair athletics. Jake sprinted desperately, but within 50 meters, Emma had already pulled ahead. By the first turn, she was leading by 20 meters. The crowd erupted in disbelief as they witnessed athletic performance beyond anything they had imagined possible. Emma's splits were phenomenal, each quarter faster than Jake's personal best times. She crossed the finish line in 48 seconds, flat, a new state record, while Jake was still struggling through the final turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced through a megaphone. "You've just witnessed Emma Rodriguez, current world record holder and Paralympic gold medalist, demonstrate why assumptions about disability are dangerous." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Students who had dismissed Emma as weak had just watched her demolish every record their school had ever produced. Jake stood frozen at the finish line, his worldview shattered. Marcus and Alex backed away, understanding they had tormented someone whose achievements dwarfed anything they would ever accomplish. "I believe you owe some apologies," Emma said calmly, removing her helmet as news crews arrived to document the story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.